Hello, good evening, everyone.
Hello, everyone.
Some people waving, some people smiling, which is nice. So, some familiar faces. I'll do a half an hour presentation and we have some interaction and questions afterwards. And then about an hour from now, we'll have a proper break, like literally 5 minutes, nothing will happen. So, you know, we've learned over time that you cannot have longer sessions than that, right? You really have to have a break every hour when you're on video. And then Rini will do a bunch of questions and presentations on the faster model. So the first bit I'll focus on Formula One, and Rini will focus on the faster model, which is in the book. Yeah, so we have a Dutch edition. The book originally was released almost a year ago in the Netherlands. And then just a few months ago, released it in the English language edition in the UK, US, and worldwide. And I think it was October, November, the German edition also was available, which for some reason looks totally different. All right, so I want to share with you some insights about how to make your organization as fast and agile as a Formula One team. And most of you probably know this, right? Most of our organizations are a little bit broken, just what I saw from your answers there. It's pretty difficult to get lots of innovation done. We're suffering from meeting overload, from email overload, decision-making is slow. And as an organization designer and change agent, I've been working on this problem for a long time, coming from the agile world, software development world for a while, and now trying to change leadership teams all across the world to become faster and more innovative. So I've studied lots of different organizations, but it was only recently, about 2 years ago, that I was able to look at Formula One. And then kind of my eyes went open. I think it's maybe already 3 years ago. I was able to go to Red Bull Racing. Yeah, as you saw my outfit, which is a Red Bull Racing fan outfit. I do not work at Red Bull Racing. I'm just a huge fan. And this was the view from the meeting room that we were in. So this is literally what we saw while we were having a presentation. And I don't know about your local garage, but mine doesn't look anything like this, right? There's no oil, there's no grease. Everything is just super clean and super, super high tech. And this was the kind of organization we went into and had an ability to look behind the scenes. But for those of you who do not know Formula One, you probably have heard of Ferrari. It's pretty unique that you haven't heard of Ferrari, right? It's actually listed as the strongest brand this year. And what not a lot of people know is that Ferrari actually originally started making road cars to fund the racing team. Enzo Ferrari didn't care a shit about any road cars. He thought they were boring. They were not really interesting. He just wanted to make money so he could fund his race team. So that is why he started that. But nowadays, most people know the street cars, of course. So yeah, before we're going to dive in, I'm going to share with you a little bit of details about what Formula One is all about, given that 75–50% here of the people here haven't actually regularly watched a race. So here's one of the circuits in Singapore. Is a Marina Bay circuit, and it's a night circuit. So they illuminate the whole track and they race through the narrow corners there. So yeah, what is Formula One? Well, simply put, it's 10 teams with 20 drivers, and they're doing 22 races on 5 continents in 9 months when there's no pandemic, of course. So the calendar for this year looked like this, but it was going to look radically different, and actually nobody knows exactly what it's going to look like. But usually a season is about 20 to 22 races, and they travel all across the world with 10 different teams. There's hundreds of millions of viewers all across the world, so it's actually a pretty popular sport. So yeah, then the big question was, like, how many people does it take to drive 2 cars? Like, how large is a Formula One team? Some of you guessed right, which was above 500. So let me give you the numbers from the 3 biggest teams. So Red Bull Racing, the number 3 team, they employ roughly 700 people. Ferrari employs roughly 1,100 people, and Mercedes is the largest with about 1,500 people. And yeah, so that's pretty unsurprising. It's actually the largest team sport in the world. And Ferrari and Mercedes are the largest because they also create and build the engines that are going to be used by other teams. But most teams are somewhere between 400 and 700 people. So this is actually the average amount of people. So yeah, you can, and this is what it looks like. If you put everybody on one slide, you get a rough sense of, all these people that are basically working every day, day and night actually, to create 2 race cars and drive them 22 times all across the world. But maybe it's useful to show you a little bit of a video that shows you what all these people are working on, right? So how do you keep 700 people busy if you're just going to create a car? So here's the story of a single bolt at Red Bull Racing. Yeah, so in other words, they don't buy their screws at Gamma or at Walmart. They make them themselves. Here's all the different teams that are part of a Formula One team. So this is the team of teams setup. And actually in the clip, you only saw four different teams. You saw design team, you saw the machining shop, they saw the place where they inspect the parts and when they assemble the parts. But these are all the different teams that together are responsible for creating this very high performing race car, and they have to work together. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to have the fastest gearbox in the world if the whole car doesn't deliver totally, right, as an integrated thing. So this is the whole thing. It gives you a sense of all the teams. So yeah, how many parts are there in Formula One car? We're talking roughly about 20,000 parts, of which 80% are being built in-house. And over the course of the season, they make about 30,000 changes to these parts. And actually, we're talking about 90% of the parts are being changed, and only 10% of the parts are going to be carried into the next season without any change. So only a very small amount of parts are not changing. And yeah, if you think about it, a usual 9-month season, we're talking about roughly 1,000 changes per week. So isn't it amazing that you're able to make 1,000 changes to a car with this amount of people? So I'm always curious, like, so why do they do this, right? So what's the reason that they think this is useful? Well, most importantly, all the teams are trying to constantly improve and are trying to constantly make their car go faster. And over the course of the season, these cars become roughly 2 seconds per lap faster. So imagine if you would arrive at the first race in Australia and you win the race because you have the fastest car, and then you decide not to innovate anymore. You will be really quickly behind in the grid, because 2 seconds is roughly the difference between starting at the front and starting at the back of the grid. So yeah, these teams are constantly doing that. They're constantly looking at each other's car. They're constantly spying on each other to figure out what the other teams are doing. So yeah, how do they do it? How do we get to this high amount of innovation speed in a highly regulated environment? That is the interesting thing for me. So imagine this is the podium ceremony, right? So you have Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, and Sebastian Vettel standing on the podium, celebrating their their podium places. And these people, they are famous. They are very rich. They have a jet set lifestyle, some more than others. So imagine after the race, Lewis Hamilton gets drunk and flies his private jet home, throws a party in his in his Manhattan penthouse, or in his Monaco Monaco yacht. So there's all these different options for him. But before he does it, maybe that's what he does. But before he does that, something else happens, which is actually more interesting to me, and that's this. Before they go home or throw a huge party, they have an all-hands race debrief. So you'll see here about 40, 50 engineers with headphones on, listening to each other, talking to each other, and even a whole team in the factory is part of this debrief session. Lewis Hamilton is sitting there in the middle, and across of him is Nico Rosberg. His picture is a few years old. And they're going through a checklist, and they're trying to understand everything that happened during the race that they can learn from. So how were the brakes? How was the steering? How was our pit stop strategy? What happened with the tires? What happened with our aerodynamics and the balance? Everything is going to be checked and talked about briefly and touched upon to see what we can capture from this race. So even Mercedes, who's actually dominating the sport at the moment, still does this because they understand that if they stop doing this, they won't be able to dominate the sport anymore. And this section actually lasts longer than the race. It's a 2-hour session, while most races are less than 2 hours. And this is actually only 1 out of 50 different meetings that are pre-planned over the course of a race weekend. So these Formula One teams, they have a rhythm of learning and interlocking meetings that are focused on continuously reflecting on what's happening and continuously reflecting on what we can improve. These are learning machines, basically. Another important thing that's happening on their weekly rhythm is the Monday morning factory debrief. So on the left here is Toto Wolff in front of the team at Mercedes. On the right, you see Christian Horner all the way to the back at the Red Bull Racing factory. I actually took the photo that you saw earlier from the top right glass that you can still see there. There was a meeting room. So what they do, they talk to their engineers. They can bring only 60 people to the circuit. So 700 or even 1,000 people that worked on the car in the previous week are sitting at home watching the race, hoping that the car doesn't fall apart. So this is a super important moment where the team principals and team key engineers that were at the race debrief with everyone involved. And they set the priorities for the upcoming period. They answer any questions that people may have. And why is this so important? I think this is so important because it actually creates speed and agility, because all these teams, they have their own responsibility. They have their own part of the car they're working on. And if you attend this session, you actually already know everything that you need to know to do your work in the upcoming period. You don't necessarily need to throw a meeting or ask for what is the right thing to do, because you already know what is the right thing to do. And everybody will go back to their own team and work on the parts that they're responsible for. So this creates speeds and agility. And when researching other fast organizations, I actually saw a similar pattern. So at teams with Google, Spotify, Facebook, with huge online sessions, they do a similar things, even with 60 to 100,000 people at once. The leadership goes on stage and shares everything that's going on. Another important thing, and Rini is going to talk about this a bit more, is clarity of purpose. So everyone in a Formula One team knows exactly what is the thing that we're trying to achieve here. And this is reinforced at Red Bull Racing. When you enter the factory, you'll see a huge wall of all the different prizes that they've ever won. And what happens is, you come into the factory and you immediately understand that this is the thing I'm trying to do here. And every team knows that this is the ultimate goal. While in most commercial organizations or other large organizations, it's not always very clear what your contribution is as a team or as an individual to the overarching purpose of the organization. So creating this clarity is key for any business. Another thing that Formula One is famous for is pit stops. And I want to show you a short clip of how pit stops evolved over the years.
But Holland comes in for a pit stop. Time to refuel and change tires. Lou Moore himself changes the tires. It's a tense time. Holland stays in his seat, anxious to get away. Let's watch. Tires are changed at last. A crewman polishes the windshield as Holland moves away just 67 seconds after he stopped.
So yeah, 67 seconds or 1.92 seconds. And actually the current world record broken by Red Bull last year was about 1.78 seconds. So it's getting faster every moment. And there's obviously some differences, but it's a huge difference in 50 years or actually 70 years that they've been able to change this. The question I have for you, and we're going to do a bit of a poll right now, so pay attention. The question I have for you is, which one is more efficient? Is it the 67 seconds one or the 1.92 seconds? So yeah, let me know what you think. Which of the two is more efficient? And if you want, you can, I'm just going to open up the chat so you can clarify your answer if you want. Right, about 50-50, interesting. People are still voting. 31 people voted. Yeah, so if you want, if you have an idea, like why would you pick one of the two, drop it in the chat. There's a few ideas there.
As an academic, Jurriaan, of course, I'm interested in what the definition of efficient is. But I'm pretty sure you're going to clarify that later, right?
Right. Or you can just keep it ambiguous. Let me end the poll and share the results with you. It's interesting how it's almost like a 50-50 tie. So what do we see here? What Alex said, one person versus whole team, really expensive. Smaller team, everyone is contributing. Yeah, I don't know exactly what you voted, so it's difficult for me to see what it's arguing for. But yeah, obviously you can make the argument that efficiency is about resource utilization, for example. Right. So in the case of resource utilization, you can actually see that the first one is more efficient because during the race, only 2 people are doing nothing. Right, the 2 or 3 people that are involved in the pit stop during the race are, are just doing nothing, which is just a small amount of people. While with the group, the whole group, 22 people doing the pit stop, they'll be doing nothing during the race. So that's not really efficient, right? So let's see what other people think. efficiency is reaching the goal. So that's another argument. So I guess, again, I agree, like there's a definition question here, and it's always a controversy when I ask this question. So let me go back to my presentation. Rini, any reflections on that before we go on?
Well, maybe when talking about Formula One teams and pit stop, we shouldn't talk about efficiency at all.
No, well, I mean, it's not very efficient, but obviously it is pretty effective. So let me just go on. Let me just go on to share my screen again. Yeah. So yeah, my argument would be this one is more effective because winning or losing races, the pit stop will define if you're able to win or lose a race. It's one of the most important factors in modern day Formula One racing. And there's a few other things that are interesting. So in my opinion, like what was effective 100 years ago is no longer effective today, right? So for a long time when we had pretty simple organizations and simple production, we could design and really optimize the organization for efficiency. And the way we've done it is by planning all the different steps of the production process, predicting it and trying to control it as tightly as possible with at least amount of variation. We've become pretty good at that. And a lot of business and management theory is done around that. Well, obviously with the 21st century, we have to design our organizations for adaptivity, or at least build another muscle to kind of be able to do both, right? To be able to sense and respond and adapt to the environment. And Formula One teams are very, very well capable of adapting to their environment. So another tidbit from pit stops is that you will not see a job posting somewhere which says, we need a tire changer and, we need you only 2 seconds per weekend. And 2 seconds per week you're working and all the other time you're not working, right? So there's no such thing as a full-time tire changer. These are all people with other responsibilities that are taking on an additional role in the pit stop team. So for example, at Red Bull, the person that's jacking up the car in the front is actually responsible for logistics, and he'll be, driving a truck back and forth between the airport and the circuit when they're traveling internationally. And the person who's removing the wheel on the right rear at Red Bull is actually one of the IT folks that is mainly responsible for setting up the connectivity before the weekend starts. So during the race, actually, he doesn't have anything to do. So that's why if you create an organization where we can have roles in different teams and people can pick their own roles, you'll create lots of fluidity and agility in your organization. You'll see that pattern more and more in future organizations. I want to talk to you a little bit about failure and what it could look like in Formula One. So yeah, this is one of the expressions of failure in F1. This is Mark Webber at the end of the pit lane a couple of years ago with only 3 wheels attached. And his race is over, right? 1 out of 20 scoring opportunities is gone. You could say like 5% of his season is messed up because somebody made a mistake at the pit stop. So yeah, and I'm curious always like what would happen in your organization if one person's mistake results in a loss of 5% of all yearly revenue, right? 5% is one race. Many times the person will be fired or blamed, especially if you can track it back to one person. And really depending on the size of the organization, we can talk here about mistake that's a multi-million-dollar or maybe $100 million mistake. So that's a challenge. But if in F1 they understand that we have to change this thinking a little bit. So one of the things that Formula One teams understand, it is rarely just one person's error. And it's really important to look at the whole system to understand what happened. So yeah, here's a fishbone diagram. There's different ways of understanding the root cause of an issue. But in this case, the effect was pretty clear, right? We drove away with the wheel not being attached. The wheel not being attached. But actually what happened in this situation is the person the responsible for replacing the wheel, when he removed the wheel nut and came back to the wheel, he discovered that the wheel nut was broken. So he had to, that was an equipment failure. So he had to throw away the wheel nut, grab a spare one from his belt. But by the time he was back at the wheel, the car was already gone. So there was actually also a communications failure and a signaling failure. So the person responsible for giving the green light thought that the wheel change was successful. So yeah, what would have happened if they would just fire this person and moved on? Well, maybe it will happen again next race. So they really so much focused on learning that they rarely create some blame around it. And Rob Smedley is one of the engineers who said it quite nicely, is when you have a blame culture, people spend 60 to 90% of the effort covering what they've done rather than understanding the problem, which would make the car go quicker. So blame culture is very expensive. And in other words, if people are afraid to make mistakes, they will never push to the limit. And that's exactly what you need in a Formula One environment. And I would say that's exactly what you need in some innovation-heavy organizational environments. Another thing that I want to talk a little bit about leadership before we end. What is super important in this organization, and we're talking about a team of teams, right? Where we have multiple teams together need to be successful. And one of the things that they do every morning and every end of the day is a stand-up, right? Like the one you see here. You'll have people, representatives from each sub-team come to the table and talk about what is going on with our part, and do we need to wait for your part to come, or do we need to do I need to work late so I can integrate your latest innovation? And I would be happily to do that if I know it in advance. So twice per day there's a synchronization going on in the factory. So the leaders of the teams are creating a culture of a one-team mindset. Just like in any organization above 100 people, you'll have some tribal behavior, like us versus them. And this is the biggest challenges when you're scaling, this autonomy. And the other thing is they create rituals that kind of enable this cross-silo collaboration. One of the, unfortunately, still only one female team principal is Claire Williams from Williams Racing. And she says, well, bring in lots of clever people and give them the freedom to do their jobs, delegate and give your employees the authority to take action. And if you will read or watch an interview with any of the team principals in F1, they'll all let you know that, I mean, they hire the best people and they enable them to do their job, because they, as a team principal, it's you're unable to understand all the different things, and you're not the best person that is knows more than everything else. So they're really creating an enabling organization. That basically concludes my bit. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and start thinking if you have any questions. Let's see. The chat is open. So my idea for this bit is, if you have a question, please drop it in the chat, and I'll unmute you if you want to verbalize the question, if you have one.
Maybe in the meantime, I can ask you a first question,
Sure.
Jurriaan. I've prepared 3, so we'll see what happens.
Uh-oh.
But I know you're a consultant, you're a company advisor. What is really the last time in practice where you used F1 or a specific F1 inspiration to actually change one of your clients or one of their organizations? So what's the last thing that really you said, I did this in an organization, and to be honest, I got the inspiration from F1?
Well, I get my inspiration from a lot of different places, but definitely one of the rituals I installed a couple months ago at a large bank was to have this all hands meeting. So to have a rhythm of, in this case, it was a monthly meeting where a couple of the leaders came together and were available for the 500 people that were in the department to answer any questions and to share their thoughts of what was going on in the organization. So that's one of the things. This all hands ask me anything session is one of my favorite things that I'd love to implement. So Rob has a question: how to celebrate success. Let me just unmute you, Rob, if you will be comfortable vocalizing. Hey, Rob, nice to see you again.
Hey, Jurriaan. Hi. Hope you're doing well. Yeah, I see that you're doing well. When a race has been won, for example, by Max, everybody's proud of him. But how do they celebrate success within the organization? There was 750 people, and even the cleaning man, he takes part in this. How do they organize that?
Well, I think especially Red Bull is pretty good at throwing parties. Not only for their colleagues, but for everyone. There's a few teams that have always been very famous for throwing the best parties at any race. So yeah, I mean, there's lots of booze involved. And there's definitely some videos out there from teams celebrating. And at the factory, they do the same. Some teams, there's some examples out there where they bring in all the family and the kids for a special event too. So it's not only the people that are at the factory that are enabling this, but all the families of these people obviously too. So they celebrate with them too. So I'll see a few more questions here.
Yeah, maybe you could answer the question of Marta, which I think is a really interesting one.
So let me just unmute Marta for a moment. Marta.
Hi, it's Carl. It's my wife's profile I'm using. I've not got.
Oh, nice. Hi, girl.
Hi. Yeah, I just wondered, sort of like, if you could put the team aside, which team principal would you work for? Whether that was in business, and why would that be?
Which team principal would I work for? It's an interesting one. I mean, most of them are pretty good. There's a few I wouldn't work for.
Okay.
I mean, I've seen some, and somebody mentioned Netflix too, right? So the guy at Netflix. So what's his name again? Gunther from Haas.
Yeah.
He seemed to be the one who is threatening a lot with firing people and wringing people's necks. So I'm not sure if he really gets it. At the same time, I've also saw Claire Williams announce a few things that sounded really bureaucratic. So yeah, sometimes you get these tidbits and you get a little bit of a taste of what these team principles are about. But I've seen Toto Wolff and Christian Horner and also Binotto from Ferrari really showing a lot of enabling leadership in all of their interviews. So there's definitely good examples out there. And maybe that's why those three teams are on the top, right? You know, you never know.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks for your question. Awesome. Any other ones, Rini, you think I should answer?
Well, you picked that one as well. Yeah, this one where you just said you gave the names of the richest teams.
Right.
So then it's most people. If I would say 2 years ago, I would say, yeah, well, for sure they are the richest, so they'll win. But by now, I start to get the idea that the more richest are able to hire the better managers.
I don't know, or the best engineers and the best drivers.
Yeah. So it may not be a coincidence that exactly these guys that you take as the leaders are at the best teams.
Yeah, I don't know if it's always money driven. So Christian Horner started at Red Bull, I think, already 10 years ago, and he was not really a big hotshot. He just built his team from scratch. Maybe I can unmute Srikant Ramanujam. Sorry to butcher your name, because he actually asked a question about money. Are you there?
Yeah, actually, I answered that too. In 2022, they are changing the regulations, of course. So they are capping the amount of money that can be spent. So that will kind of bring some parity between the teams. So waiting to see what happened at that time. Yeah.
So yeah, so maybe as for organizations, this is a self-reinforcing cycle, right? So because Mercedes is so successful, they get lots of value out of being an F1, right? A lot of people buy a Mercedes because they know the brand through Formula One. And that obviously allows the corporate headquarters to pump in more money into the team to kind of continuously reinforce that cycle. And that's why it's so hard to compete. So if you're Haas, a privateer organization, just from an entrepreneur in the United States, his budget is like not even 20% of the highest team's budget, and he's trying to compete in the same field, which is near impossible. So like you said, they're putting in a budget cap to level the playing field a little bit, which hopefully allows other teams to to compete at the front of the field. So let's take two more, and then we'll maybe go to the break. Would you like to work at an F1 team? Yes, of course.
Is this an offer?
It is no, probably not. I guess it depends. Definitely fun to do.
Can I ask you a question, Jurriaan?
Yeah, go ahead.
I never asked you before. You of course, apparently you're a Formula One fan, and you use it also in your business life. But if you had to pick another sport than F1, to get inspiration for business improvement and speed, and it would not be F1, what would be the sport that you say, well, I think I could also find some inspiration over there to improve organizations?
Sure. It's interesting because I actually don't watch much other sports, to be honest. I don't really care about anything other than racing. But recently I've worked with a football player union. And when we were doing some of their sessions with their board, we decided to take some metaphors from football and from good coaches. And there's actually a lot of good coaches out there that have a similar style where they understand they need to create the conditions for all these players that together to integrate, to thrive, and you win together or you lose together, right? The best teams understand that. There's no guarantee that if you put any star players together, that this is a high functioning team. But actually most teams are pretty terrible, right? Like that. Do you have any other examples, Rini? Maybe some from sport metaphors that you like?
Well, besides the things that we'll talk about later, and we talk about speed.
Of course.
What's for me is very interesting at the moment, and you're mentioning football, but let's say I would say team sports oriented sports, because we are setting up organizations around cross-functional multidisciplinary teams. And I wonder what we could learn from organization or sports organizations where also the team is the core entity, because it's not just a team, but there's also individual growth and career development. And I'm really curious how large sports organizations are able to meld these together. That at the one hand, the team is most important because they win the races or they win the matches, but at the same time, the individual career and growth and skill development goes hand in hand. That would be really interesting how to do this.
Right,
because
right.
most organizations I visit, they still put the individual at the core and not the team.
Yeah, that's a good point for sure. Let's just do one more question. The iPad 3 asked a question, and I've just unmuted you. I'm not sure if you have your video on, but could you explain a little bit more about rituals and how it helps a cross-functional team? Are you there? iPad 3? No? Okay, that's fine. But I'll answer it anyway. And Rini is going to talk a little bit more about team meetings and team rituals, but it's just super important to create a rhythm of sessions where everybody knows that when we're having a question or a discussion or an action item, the next meeting is already on your calendar. You don't necessarily need to plan that. And even more important, for example, a meeting where you reflect on how things are going. Why not have a monthly meeting where you just sit down and reflect how things are going? In Agile, we call them retrospectives. And if it's already scheduled and it's already on the calendar, you don't need to take the risk or the personal risk or to kind of put it on the calendar because it's already there. So you can literally just wait until the next moment. And if everybody understands that that's the way we operate as a team, and that's how we learn and reflect together, it's actually quite safe. You lower the threshold to bring up any things. All right.
Well, one question more, Jurriaan,
okay, last one.
You actually haven't said much about the book.
No, I haven't.
Maybe you can, and 67% of the people haven't watched this, and we're going to the break, so we can maybe also make this a little bit of commercial break, but that's not the question I have. The question I have for you, what's the most fun response or the most fun thing that happened to you after the Formula X appeared?
Right. So there's a couple things. One of the things that actually happened most recently is that I was contacted by the race director of the Abu Dhabi F1 race. So he reached out when he saw a video I took with race marshals that was related to the book. And he said, wow, that's interesting. I've never thought of our organization as a team of teams. So can we just have a chat? Because I'm creating this training program for FIA flag marshals worldwide, and I would like to pick your brain. So that was like, what? That was definitely not something I expected. I don't really work a lot in motorsport. I'm just watching it and trying to take business lessons from it. So that was definitely very high up on the list. And I kind of asked him if I could be in the race control room in Abu Dhabi at the next race. And he's like, fine, if you can get the press pass, which probably is a bigger challenge.
Oh, but in fact, you're giving back now to F1.
Exactly, yeah, maybe.
That's cool. That's cool.
All right, we're going to take a break. And after the break, Rini will dive in with the faster model and the takeaways from the book and how to apply them in business. So I propose that we'll be back at 8 o'clock sharp if you are in Amsterdam. So in 8 minutes from now, feel free to drop off the call and drop back in wherever you want, or just mute and stop your video. And we'll be back in 8 minutes.
Yes, see you
See you.
after the break.